21 years ago, Naomi Landers walked into a church daycare with her infant son and left without him. No struggle, no witnesses, just silence and a name that echoed through every room she entered after. She never left Grayson Hills. Her address stayed, her job at the library stayed, but the part of her that knew lullabies and soft dawns never returned. It vanished the moment Micah did. Naomi Landers never forgot the smell of polished oak and lemon-scented floor wax that filled the hallways of St. Bartholomew Church. Even now, over 2 decades later, that fragrance could ambush her memory like a ghost with unfinished business. On that warm April morning in 2004, she had arrived at the church daycare in a rush, juggling Micah on her hip and a stack of donation envelopes in her hand. Her heart was beating faster than usual, partly from the coffee she had gulped down too quickly, partly because of the sleepless night before. Micah had been teething. He cried off and on through the night, and Naomi, as a single mother trying to hold everything together, hadn't slept more than 3 hours. The morning sun poured in through the stained glass, throwing fractured colors across the marble floor as she entered. A choir rehearsal echoed faintly from the chapel down the hall. Naomi didn't hear the children's laughter she was used to. That absence, she would remember later, should have told her something was off. But she had only one thing on her mind, dropping Micah off and rushing to her shift at the bakery. She greeted Sister Eleanor with a tired smile at the check-in table and handed Micah over to the woman she had come to know over the past few months, Lillian Crow. Lillian was 24, soft-spoken, and always humming old hymns under her breath. She wore her long brown hair pinned up neatly, and children seemed to love her. Naomi never questioned her trust, but as she turned to leave that morning, something unexpected happened. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, darted out of the hallway and collided with Naomi's legs. She stumbled backward, twisted her ankle on the polished floor, and crashed into the stone wall. The back of her head struck hard, and the lights around her dimmed into gray. The last thing she remembered was the boy's panicked face and someone shouting her name. When Naomi came to, she was in the church's infirmary, a cool cloth pressed to her forehead, her head pounding like a bass drum. Sister Eleanor hovered nearby, a worried furrow etched deep between her brows. "Where's Micah?" Naomi had asked immediately, her voice cracking with panic. "Where's my baby?" That's when the whirlwind began. No one could find Micah. The daycare staff had thought he was with Naomi. Naomi believed she had handed him off. Sister Eleanor went pale. The records showed Lillian had signed in, but not out. Her belongings were gone. Security footage? There was none. The daycare's cameras had been disabled for maintenance, and the one functioning camera in the chapel hallway showed only blurred movement, a shadow passing quickly outside frame. Naomi screamed. She tore through the sanctuary, ripped open closets, searched behind pews, and collapsed on the tile in tears. Police were called. The church went into lockdown. By evening, local news vans swarmed outside the cathedral gates, and Micah's face, wide-eyed and gummy-smiled, flashed across every screen in Grayson Hills. The investigation revealed troubling details. Lillian Crow had started volunteering at the church daycare 6 months prior, recommended by a member of the congregation. No one knew much about her past. Her references led to disconnected numbers. Her listed address was a P.O. box. Within 48 hours, an Amber Alert was issued, flyers printed, and a statewide search commenced. But Micah and Lillian were gone, vanished like vapor in a beam of light. Naomi refused to believe her son was simply gone. "People don't just disappear," she told detectives through clenched teeth. She refused sleep, refused food, spent days haunting the police station with printed photographs and tear-stained notes. A week later, a child from the daycare, Lily Gable, said something strange. She told a counselor that Miss Lillian said she had to run. She told Micah, "It's okay, baby. Mommy's taking you somewhere safe now." The statement was documented, but no leads surfaced. The town held a candlelight vigil that Sunday. Naomi stood in front of the church holding a flickering flame in her trembling hand. Her knees buckled halfway through the prayer. She dropped to the steps, sobbing the name Micah into her hands, a mother trying to hold onto a thread unraveling fast. The case slowly lost momentum. By the end of the year, it was classified as cold. Naomi never stopped searching, but the town moved on. St. Bartholomew updated their security system, a new daycare coordinator was hired, and the name Micah Landers faded from headlines, then from whispers. But Naomi never moved away. She stayed in Grayson Hills, working as a librarian, walking the same streets, always glancing twice at the face of every boy with dark curls and dimples. She never changed her phone number, just in case. Never sold Micah's crib, which remained untouched in her small apartment, blanketed in dust and silent prayers. She had a dream once, 2 years after the abduction, where she stood in a field under a sky smeared with violet clouds. Micah was there, walking toward her in slow motion, older now, with the same crescent-shaped birthmark that curved around his right cheek. "Don't stop looking," he whispered in the dream. "I'm still here." So she didn't, and 21 years later, on a gray spring afternoon, as Naomi walked past the Grayson Hills train station, she heard a voice, low, trembling, steeped in sorrow and honey, singing the same lullaby she had once whispered to Micah, in the very crib that still waited. The hardest part wasn't the silence. It was the sound of people trying to fill it with explanations. In the months following Micah's disappearance, Naomi met with every detective assigned to the case, attended every debrief, and sat through hours of interviews with child psychologists, but nothing ever bridged the gap between what she remembered and what the world claimed had happened. The file grew thicker with each week, bloated with reports, assumptions, and witness statements, yet not one page told the truth she needed. 2 months after the abduction, Naomi was called into the precinct and ushered into a cramped interview room with buzzing fluorescent lights and a folder already opened on the table. Detective Alan Grisham, young and dispassionate, tapped a sheet of paper as she sat down. "Her statement," he said, not unkindly, "comes from Pastor George Barrett." Naomi blinked. "What statement?" Grisham slid it across. George had written that Naomi, upon arrival at the daycare that morning, had spoken with Lillian privately. He claimed he overheard Naomi say, "I trust you, just take him while I get something from the car." According to George, Naomi then handed Micah to Lillian and walked off. Naomi stared at the page as if it were written in another language. "That never happened," she said softly. "I wouldn't leave him like that, and I never went to the car." Grisham sighed. "We're not saying you meant harm, but with the head trauma," he trailed off, referencing the medical note in her file. The hospital had documented a minor concussion and possible retrograde amnesia. Naomi felt her throat tighten. "You think I forgot giving away my son?" Grisham didn't answer. The implication hung in the air like smoke. From that moment she realized the weight of not remembering might be worse than the memory itself. It meant they would always doubt her. George Barrett, with his calm voice and trusted collar, had planted a seed, and it was growing in the soil of uncertainty. Over the next year, Naomi was slowly edged out of the investigation. Leads dwindled, press coverage faded, newer cases replaced Micah's story in the rotation of tragedy. People stopped asking questions. But Naomi didn't stop searching. She filed requests for the daycare's former staff records, sent dozens of emails to child protection agencies, even traveled out of state to follow tips that amounted to nothing more than desperate guesses. She became familiar with the bitter aftertaste of false hope. Her apartment turned into a labyrinth of boxes labeled Micah. Folders, newspaper clippings, and photos littered every available surface. She didn't throw away anything, not even the smallest notes scribbled on napkins during late-night breakfast. 2 years after the disappearance, Naomi was cleaning out an old storage box in her closet when she came across the dusty Fisher-Price cassette recorder Micah used to love tapping. She had kept it out of sentiment, assuming the batteries had long since died, but on impulse she popped in a fresh pair and pressed play. The recording crackled to life with a distorted hum, then her own voice, humming the lullaby she'd sung every night since Micah was born. "Go to sleep, little star," she whispered on the tape, her voice caught in the grain of the magnetic strip. Then, unmistakably, a baby's cooing, a soft gurgle, the sound Micah always made before drifting off. But after 30 seconds, something changed. The lullaby stopped. Naomi's voice cut out. In its place, the faint shuffling of feet and a second voice, quieter, breathy. "It's okay, we're going on a little trip." Then the sound of a door creaking and Micah beginning to cry. The tape ended in static. Naomi stood frozen for a full minute, her fingers clamped around the recorder like a vice. She took it to the police the next day, heart racing, convinced she'd uncovered a crucial clue. The recording was handed to audio technicians who ran it through their equipment, enhancing it as much as they could. 3 days later, she was called in for a follow-up, a different detective this time, older and colder. "It's inconclusive," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Could be interference, could be an old recording of you playing." Naomi's jaw clenched. "That voice at the end wasn't me." "You can't remember the day, Naomi," he said. "How can you be sure?" She left the station trembling. The cassette was returned to her in a small plastic bag. Evidence, but not enough. Truth, but not legal proof. She played the tape again that night, sitting alone in the dark, listening not just for Micah's cry, but for the betrayal that came afterward. Every time the unknown voice said, "We're going on a little trip," she gripped her knees tighter. Eventually, she began sleeping with the recorder under her pillow. She played it before job interviews, before going to the grocery store, before walking into church on Sundays, daring herself to face the altar of a building where she once lost everything. George Barrett still led sermons there, still wore the white collar and warm smile. Sometimes he even spoke about miracles and the virtue of forgiveness. Naomi never stayed past the second hymn. She started to dream, in fragments again, not of Micah, but of peace. A crib turning into a door, a hymn turning into static, a pair of hands, not her own, lifting a child and whispering reassurances. Every time she woke, her heart beat so hard she couldn't tell if it was real or just a manifestation of her guilt. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the ache, a different feeling grew. Not quite hope, not yet. Something older, more primal, a refusal to accept that Micah was just a name on a poster or a memory she'd misfiled. So she started walking again, not just through town, but through old neighborhoods, past the homes of families she hadn't spoken to in years. She asked questions others were too tired to ask. She stopped people on the street if they had a familiar look. The library where she worked had become her fortress. She began spending hours in the archives, cross-references, people logs, even names from the nearby children's choir that Lillian had once helped organize. At night, she'd sit by the window with the tape recorder playing softly on a loop, its final hiss now etched into her memory like a scar. She didn't know what she was looking for anymore, a face, a sound, a word, but she knew one day she would find it, because something inside her whispered that someone out there still remembered that cry. That lullaby, that voice that had said, "We're going on a little trip." And if they remembered, then maybe they, too. The early spring air carried a crispness that clung to the skin, not quite cold, but enough to make Naomi wrap her cardigan tighter around her ribs as she exited the Grayson Hills library. The city had changed subtly over 2 decades. New coffee shops tucked between old churches, glass-paneled bus stops replacing wooden benches, teenagers scrolling through their phones where she used to sit with Micah, nursing juice boxes and coloring books. But the train station had stayed mostly the same. It still smelled faintly of engine grease and old leather, and the large analog clock hanging over Platform 3 still ticked with the same stubborn rhythm. Naomi often took the long way home, passing the station without purpose, drawn by the idea of people going somewhere even when she couldn't. On that particular Tuesday, she heard it before she saw it, the music. It was soft at first, blending into the shuffle of commuters and the buzz of vending machines. But then the melody floated above the noise, delicate, stretched out like a thread of memory across the platform. Naomi stopped walking. She knew that song. Her breath hitched. "The Sky Waits," someone once called it. She had no name for it back then. It had been a hum, a lullaby, something she stitched together night after night when Micah wouldn't sleep, weaving the notes through whispered kisses and the warm scent of baby lotion. The tune didn't exist on any radio. She had made it. Now it was coming from across the terminal. She turned, heart clenching, and saw a young man seated on the far side of the station, guitar balanced on his knee, head tilted slightly as he sang. He wasn't performing in the way most street musicians did, no amp, no flashy sign, just a simple open case with a few coins and a folded slip of paper that read, "Thank you for listening." His voice was low, textured with gravel and wind, and yet carried a tenderness that stopped people in their tracks. Naomi felt her knees weaken. She walked slowly, as if through fog, unable to take her eyes off him. The sunlight was slanting through the high windows at just the right angle, catching on the edge of his cheek, where something shimmered faintly. A tattoo, perhaps, or makeup? No! As the breeze stirred his rolled sleeves higher, Naomi's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a tattoo. Not completely. Beneath the black ink swirling like smoke on his forearm, she saw it, the edge of a birthmark, curved and jagged, arcing just above his wrist and disappearing beneath the fabric. She knew that shape. She had memorized every inch of it, back when it bloomed across Micah's face, from cheek to hairline, like a flame frozen in skin. Naomi's heart thundered. She stepped closer, but not too close. From this angle, she could take in the details, the way his fingers moved over the strings with practiced ease, the faint crease between his brows as he sang the final note and let it hang in the air like mist. She didn't speak, couldn't. Instead, she pretended to rummage through her bag while sneaking glances. His eyes were deep-set, framed by lashes that made his expression seem older than his youth suggested. He was tall, but his frame still held the lankiness of someone not long out of adolescence. 20, maybe 21. The moment he finished, a few people clapped softly. He gave a nod in acknowledgement, but didn't speak. Naomi watched as he leaned forward to gather his things, and that's when she saw the name embroidered on the strap of his guitar. Isa Wynn. It sounded invented. Stage name, maybe? Or perhaps real. Either way, it felt familiar in a way that made her stomach twist. She took out her phone and snapped a picture, not of him directly, but of the guitar and his hand as he adjusted a tuning peg. Then she turned and walked quickly out of the station before he could look up and catch her staring. At home, her fingers trembled as she uploaded the image to her computer. She enhanced the contrast, zoomed in on the patch of skin beneath the ink. It was there, faint, yes, but undeniably his. A flame-shaped birthmark with a forked tail, trailing like lightning across the flesh. Naomi's lungs forgot how to work. She rummaged through the hospital photo of Micah at 7 months. There it was again, bold and fresh on baby's skin. There was no mistaking it. No two birthmarks matched so precisely. Her hands shook as she placed the two images side by side. That night, she couldn't sleep. Instead, she played the old cassette recording again, and this time it sounded different, not because of the quality, but because of the echo. The echo between the voice on the tape and the voice she'd just heard at the station. Not identical, not yet, but connected. The next morning, Naomi returned to the station. Ezra was there again, in the same spot, singing the same kind of soft, aching melody. She stood farther back this time, watching as people dropped coins in his case and passed by with polite nods. She noticed he wore the same denim jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and that he smiled gently at a child who danced near the column beside him. It was the smile that nearly broke her, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it wasn't. Micah had smiled like that, crooked and slow, as if uncertain the world would smile back. She remembered holding his tiny body, kissing that smile into being. Ezra looked up once, and their eyes met, just for a moment. He offered a polite nod, the kind you give to a stranger you see more than once. Naomi's heart thudded painfully. She nodded back and moved away. Back home, she opened a file on her laptop she hadn't dared touch since the investigation stalled. She created a new folder and labeled it Ezra Wynn. Then she started digging. Public records, social media, music forums. There wasn't much. A few blurry videos of street performances. A comment thread where someone asked, "Where'd this guy come from?" And someone else replied, "Just showed up one day. Quiet, doesn't say much." Naomi found a community page mentioning him playing at the local farmer's market. That gave her a location. She made plans to go. She printed the photo. She circled the birthmark. She whispered to the empty apartment, "If you're really him, if you're really my boy, then you'll remember the song." Because the sky still waited. And maybe, just maybe, so did he. Naomi's fingers moved with a kind of quiet fury over the keyboard as she sat at the library's research desk well past closing hours, the old lamp above casting a soft golden cone of light onto the cluttered workspace. The picture of Ezra's guitar strap with his name had been cropped, enhanced, and now fed through every search engine and database she could think of. She was careful, methodical, and fueled by an adrenaline that neither coffee nor grief alone could explain. At first, the results were sparse. Ezra Wynn wasn't in any public school registries, no high school yearbook entries, no local award announcements or college admission mentions. For someone who appeared fully grown and highly literate, his name didn't exist in any formal educational databases. Naomi widened the search, shifting focus from traditional records to fringe religious forums, local obituaries, archived blog posts. That's when she found it. A short, dusty blog entry from 2016, written by a former volunteer at a small, off-the-grid religious commune called the Shepherd's Fold, located just outside Grayson Hills in the wooded valley near Miller's Branch. The post was titled, "Leaving the Fold, My Story," and buried halfway through, one line froze Naomi mid-breath. There was a boy named Ezra. Quiet, musical, always with a guitar he barely knew how to play. Raised by the head elder George, who claimed the boy was a gift from God after the death of a troubled young woman named Lillian. Naomi's eyes locked on the name, Lillian, a name she hadn't heard since the early days of the investigation. A name wrapped in disappearance and unanswered questions. Her pulse thudded hard as she read on. The writer mentioned that the Shepherd's Fold was intentionally disconnected from most government systems. No formal schooling, no state medical records, no legal guardianship filings. Children were registered only within the commune, under their spiritual names, often changed from whatever name they arrived with. Naomi clicked through the rest of the blog, which included showing Ezra, but one caught her attention. In the background, almost out of frame, a teenage boy sat on a wooden bench beside an older man in clerical robes. The man had white hair and a familiar posture. Naomi downloaded the photo, zoomed in. She couldn't see the boy's face clearly, but she could feel it was him. The guitar case leaning beside him had the same distinctive wear pattern as the one she saw at the station. She leaned back, gripping the arms of her chair, her thoughts spinning. George. George Barrett. Not just a pastor, not just a man from her past, but the one person who had offered testimony that Naomi had handed off her baby willingly. And now he was connected to Ezra, a young man with no birth records, no mother, and a half-concealed birthmark only Naomi could identify. The next morning, Naomi visited the outdoor market where Ezra sometimes played. She didn't approach him. Instead, she lingered near a honey stall, pretending to examine jars while listening. He was talking to another young man, a fellow musician, maybe a friend. Naomi caught fragments of the conversation. "You never wonder where you came from?" the friend asked. Ezra shrugged. "Sometimes, I don't have much to go on. George always said my mother died. He never even told me her name." The friend asked, "No photos? Nothing?" Ezra looked down. "Just one, maybe two, burned in a fire when I was a kid. George said they weren't worth holding on to." Naomi's heart seized. It was as if every part of her had gone still. She stepped back, mind racing, anchoring every word. Ezra had never known her, never seen her. All he had was George. George and ashes. She returned home, her fingers trembling as she dug through her storage bin, pulling out the police statements, the church bulletin, and that photo of Micah at 7 months, the one with the yellow duck onesie and the bold, unmistakable mark blooming across his right cheek. She laid it beside the grainy zoomed image from the commune blog. Even blurred and in profile, the slouch of Ezra's shoulders matched. She needed more, something closer. That evening, Naomi returned to the train station and waited. Ezra arrived like clockwork, guitar slung across his back. She stood nearby, holding her phone low, recording as he played. When he paused between songs, she stepped forward just enough to ask, "That song, did you write it?" Ezra looked up. "Kind of. It's..." Naomi nodded. "Careful. It sounds familiar, like something a mother might sing." He tilted his head, curious. "Maybe." She offered a small smile. "You play beautifully." Then she left before he could ask her name. Back home, Naomi copied the recording onto her laptop, isolating the vocals and comparing the inflection to the cassette of her own lullaby. It wasn't identical, but it carried the same rhythm, the same fragile rise and fall in the chorus. She stared at the screen for hours, unsure if she was chasing shadows or uncovering truth. She opened the blog post again and looked up the Shepherd's Fold. The commune had been shut down in 2018 due to code violations and suspected child neglect. Its members had dispersed. George's name had not appeared in any public statement. She knew he was still out there. She made another folder. This one was labeled George. Inside it she placed everything: photos, blog clippings, notes, audio files. It was time to build a case, not for the police, not yet, but for herself. Then she printed a second copy of Micah's birth certificate, the original from the hospital, still faintly creased from years of being folded and unfolded. She stared at the name, Micah David Landers, and whispered into the room, barely loud enough for anyone but herself to hear, "You're still mine." At the farmer's market the next week, Naomi brought a small stack of sheet music with her. She waited until Ezra took a break and approached him with quiet intent. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't mean to bother you, but I heard you last week. I had this song in my head ever since. It reminded me of something personal." She handed him one page, the melody line for "The Sky Waits," her own handwriting faintly smudged by time. Ezra blinked. "You wrote this?" "Long ago," she said. "For someone I lost?" He nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on the staff lines. "It's strange. I've played this song for years, but I've never seen it written down before." She didn't say anything more. She just walked away, and behind her, Ezra stared at the page as if something buried long ago had just stirred beneath the ink. The wind had begun to shift in Grayson Hills, carrying with it the scent of blooming dogwood trees and the faint, acrid tang of train smoke that always lingered near the station. Naomi moved through the days like someone caught in a slow awakening, each new detail about Ezra peeling back a layer of sleep she hadn't realized she'd lived under for years. The encounter at the farmer's market played on repeat in her mind, the way his eyes had traced the sheet music like it was familiar, the way his voice had softened when he spoke the words, "I've never seen it written down before." She hadn't meant to hand him the page, not yet. But something in the way he had looked at her, as though a door had opened without a key, made her trust the moment. And so she had gone home and reopened the oldest drawer in her apartment, the one that stuck slightly from years of swelling wood and disuse. Inside was a manila envelope, yellowed at the edges, with a rubber band that snapped the second she tugged it off. She slid out the contents carefully: hospital documents, a handprint card from Micah's birth, and then, at the very bottom, the photograph. It had been taken by a nurse who liked capturing milestones for new mothers, a candid shot of Micah at 7 months, wrapped in the duck-pated small smile Naomi had adored. In the photo he was smiling, a gummy off-center grin, and his eyes sparkled with something both mischievous and open. But what drew her focus now, as it always had, was the vivid mark that swept across his right cheek like a curling flame, arching delicately toward his brow. It had been the kind of birthmark people commented on, sometimes cruelly, sometimes with wonder. Naomi had loved it, memorized it, traced its outline each night before laying him in the crib. She stared at the photo until the shape was seared again into her mind, then pulled out the zoomed-in still of Ezra's arm from the blog post, the one taken at the Shepherd's Fold years ago. The ink of his tattoo was thick and stylized, an abstract design that coiled around the forearm, but in the gaps, just barely, she could see it. The same arc, the same curve. The birthmark, faded now with age, was there beneath the pigment, obscured but not gone. She needed confirmation. The next morning, Naomi called in a favor with an old acquaintance, Dr. Miriam Vance, a respected dermatologist and cosmetic surgeon who had once hosted a library seminar on dermatological myths. Naomi remembered her not just for her professionalism, but for her blunt kindness. She attached the images in a hypothetical analysis for a research project. When the reply came 3 hours later, Naomi opened it with shaking hands. The message was brief, clinical, and devastating in its precision. "Naomi, based on the photographic evidence you've provided, the original birthmark appears consistent with a superficial capillary malformation. The overlaying ink design likely serves to camouflage the mark, but from what I can discern, it has not been removed, only covered. Laser removal typically leaves notable scarring or alteration, and I see no such indicators here. Conclusion: the underlying mark remains intact and untouched. You're correct. Tattoos can conceal, not erase. Warm regards, Miriam. Naomi read it twice, then a third time, her eyes welling up. Not with grief, but with the sharp pang of almost certainty. She stood in the middle of her living room, the email glowing on her phone screen, and looked over at the photograph of Micah that she had propped beside the television. For the first time in years, the boy in that frame didn't feel like a ghost. He felt present, breathing. That evening she returned to the station again. Ezra was already playing when she arrived, seated, as always, under the mural of migrating geese painted decades ago across the east wall. She stood behind a column, out of sight, and listened not just to the music, but to the pauses, the imperfections, the moments when his voice dipped into something broken. She waited until he was packing up before she approached, stepping into the open just as he snapped his guitar case shut. "Hi again," she said, and his face lit up with that gentle, crooked smile. "Hey, sheet music lady," she smiled. "Naomi?" "Ezra," he said, extending a hand. She took it, noting the warmth of his palm, the strength in his fingers. Her voice trembled slightly. "I've been thinking about that melody. Where did you first hear it?" Ezra tilted his head. "Honestly, I don't know. It's like I've always had it. Since I was little." Naomi's pulse quickened. "Did George teach it to you?" Ezra's brow furrowed. "No, George hated music, actually. Said it was vanity. I had to teach myself in secret." "Did he ever say where you came from?" she asked carefully. "Did he ever say where you came from?" she asked carefully. "No name. No pictures, nothing." Naomi swallowed hard. "No birth certificate? Never seen one?" He glanced back at her, something cautious behind his eyes. "Why do you ask?" Naomi hesitated, then pulled out the photograph of Micah at 7 months. She didn't hand it over, just held it where he could see. "This is my son. He went missing when he was a baby. That mark on his face, it's the same one you're hiding under that ink." Ezra blinked, taking an instinctive step back. "Look, I'm not accusing you," she said quickly. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to know who you are, and maybe you do too." He looked down at his arm, where the edge of the tattoo peeked out from his sleeve, then back at the photo. "It's just a coincidence," he said, but his voice cracked. Naomi nodded slowly. "Maybe, but maybe it's not." They stood in silence as the trains came and went behind them, the sound of departure echoing off the tiled walls. Ezra finally spoke again, softer now. "Even if it were true, I wouldn't know how to believe it," Naomi whispered. "That makes 2 of us." Then, as he turned to leave, she pulled out one last item from her bag, a cassette, old and worn, in a clear case. "Take this," she said. "It's a lullaby, from someone who used to sing it every night." Ezra hesitated, then took the tape, turning it over in his hands like it was something alive. He looked up, and for a moment Naomi saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not memory exactly, but recognition of its absence. He didn't speak, just nodded. Then he walked away. 3 days after Ezra took the cassette tape from her trembling hands, Naomi received a letter without a return address. It arrived folded in half inside a plain white envelope, its edges slightly frayed, as if it had been handled many times before reaching her. There was no stamp, no postal mark, just her name, Naomi Landers, scrawled in careful, almost reverent handwriting. At first she thought it was another anonymous tip, something cryptic or cruel, like the ones she'd gotten years ago during the height of the investigation. People claiming they saw Micah in supermarkets, in airports, even on television. But this felt different. There was weight to the envelope, not just metaphorical. When she opened it, a folded sheet of paper slipped out, along with a small leather-bound booklet, faded and brittle at the spine. The letter, handwritten in looping cursive, read, "Dear Ms. Landers, I do not know if you still search. I do not know if you even believe there is truth left to be found. But I do know this: Lillian Crow was not a monster. She was lost, and she was lied to. I know because I held her hand as she died. And I promised her, if the time ever came, I would make this right. The journal is hers. I hope you find what you need." Her sister Clara. The convent of St. Mercy. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She sat at the edge of her bed, fingertips grazing the worn leather cover of the journal. She hadn't spoken Lillian's name aloud in years, hadn't dared to. It belonged to the shadows now, to the silent questions no one had wanted to answer. But here it was, her voice, inked into paper, preserved like a pressed flower in a book of loss. Naomi opened the journal carefully. The handwriting was small and uneven, like it belonged to someone who never believed anyone would read it. The first pages were dated 2004, the same year Micah vanished. Lillian had written about isolation, about fear, about the crushing pressure of living under George Barrett's command. She spoke of the shepherd's fold as a place where guilt was weaponized and obedience masked as redemption. Then, 2 weeks after the date Micah disappeared, the tone shifted. "I didn't steal him," one entry read, "put him because George said she was gone. He said the mother had died, that the boy was abandoned, that God was offering me a second chance at life, a chance to be something more than broken. I didn't question him. I wanted to believe it so badly. Micah. I called him Caleb. I tried to love him like my own, but every time he cried, I knew. He wasn't mine, and I wasn't hers. I was just a vessel, filling space I didn't earn." Naomi's hands began to shake. She flipped forward, the pages becoming darker, more fragmented. Descriptions of George's control became clearer. He had manipulated Lillian, exploited her loneliness and guilt, convincing her that the only way to salvation was through silent service. He had told her Naomi had died, that there was no family left to claim Micah. In a later entry, Lillian wrote, "I saw a photo once. I found it hidden in George's desk when he was away. It was a woman, dark curls, tired eyes, holding a baby wrapped in yellow. He caught me looking and took it, burned it in the fire pit, said the past was poison. That I was chosen now. That truth would only ruin us." Naomi closed her eyes. She knew the photo. It was the one she had taken just weeks before Micah vanished, the one she had framed above the crib until she couldn't bear the sight of it anymore. George had stolen even that. The later pages of the journal grew more chaotic. Lillian spoke of illness, of pain that started in her stomach and grew until she couldn't keep food down. She wrote about being sent to the convent by George when her health began to fail, a quiet disposal masked as spiritual retreat. The last entry, dated 2009, was nearly illegible, scrawled in trembling lines. "He was never mine. I wanted to make it right, but I waited too long. If anyone ever finds this, tell her. Tell her he had a birthmark like a flame. I never covered it. It was the one thing that reminded me he belonged to someone else." Naomi pressed her fingers to her lips, stifling a sob. She had spent years demonizing Lillian in her mind, picturing her as a thief, a manipulator, a void where a mother should have been. But now, reading these words, she saw her for what she truly was. A young woman exploited by a man who had rewritten every truth to suit his gospel. George Barrett had lied. Not once, not just to her, but to both of them. He had created a narrative, built a false family, and weaponized belief as a tool for control. And now, if Ezra was truly Micah, that lie had lived inside him for 21 years. Naomi folded the journal back shut, cradling it like something sacred. The room around her felt too small, too still. She stood and paced, heart thudding with renewed clarity. Lillian had not destroyed her life. George had, and perhaps, just perhaps, Ezra needed to know that as much as she did. She returned to the file on her laptop labeled George. Into it, she placed scanned copies of the journal entries, redacting nothing. Every word mattered now. Every line was evidence not just of wrongdoing, but of stolen years and broken truths. Then she reopened the voice recording of Ezra singing. She played it over the background of her old lullaby and let them merge, one feeding into the other, like a river returning to its source. The flame-shaped birthmark, the guitar, the song. The silence in Ezra's eyes. It was all there, and so was George. Naomi waited near the card catalog, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater as she glanced repeatedly at the front doors of the Grayson Hills library. She had sent the message simply, without pressure, "If you have time, I'd love to show you something." Nothing formal, just music, The library's back room has good acoustics." She hadn't expected him to say yes, but he had. When Ezra finally walked through the door, the late afternoon light filtering through the tall windows caught on the edges of his curls and the strap of his guitar bag. He looked different in this setting, less performer, more searching. Naomi offered a small, almost shy wave and gestured him toward the rear reading room, a space usually reserved for quiet tutoring sessions and Arcage Katrina sessions. As they stepped inside, the muffled hush of old books and dust wrapped around them like a soft blanket. Naomi had already set up the small outdated tape player on the table, a relic from a forgotten media room collection. She motioned for Ezra to sit and said only, "I found this recently. It's from a long time ago. I'd like you to hear it. No pressure?" He nodded, pulling his jacket tighter around him as if preparing for something unnamed. Naomi pressed play. The static kicked in first, a grainy white hiss that gave way to the fragile melody of her voice, singing a lullaby long ago etched into her bones. The tune was the same one Ezra had played at the station, the same one that had stopped her breath the first time she heard him sing. It wavered, sliding off pitch in a way only true memory can be, and then, behind her voice, the soft gurgle of a baby cooing and fussing. And finally the sound of a door. Ezra didn't move at first, but halfway through the second verse, his shoulders tensed, his mouth parted slightly, his eyes began to glisten. And then, with no warning, a single tear slipped down his cheek. He reached up to wipe it, almost startled, as if the emotion had ambushed him from a place he didn't know existed. "I don't know why I'm crying," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't remember this. I don't even know what this is." Naomi sat across from him, silent, watching. "Some things live deeper than memory," she said softly. "They don't speak in words. They speak in the body." Ezra leaned back, rubbing his hands together as if trying to ground himself. It's like I've wrapped around my ribs." Naomi nodded. She didn't need him to say anything more. She just reached over, stopped the tape, and let the silence settle between them. He left without many words, only a hesitant "thank you," and the tape still ringing somewhere inside him. The next day, Naomi was shelving books in the nonfiction section when she heard the front door open in that way she had come to recognize, hesitant, purposeful. She peeked around the shelf just as Ezra stepped inside, holding something in his hand. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between fear and understanding. "I need to talk to you," he said. She led him again to the back room, her heart hammering. Ezra didn't sit this time. He remained standing, slowly unzipping the front of his guitar bag. From the small interior pocket, he pulled out a folded, time-stained piece of paper. It looked as though it had been hidden for years, folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear. He held it out. Naomi took it with careful fingers, unfolding it gently. The ink was faded, the handwriting uneven, almost like it had been scribbled in haste. Micah Landers, born July 4, 2004. Naomi's breath caught. Her knees almost buckled, but she held firm. She stared at the name, at the date, at the shaky scrawl that had somehow survived in secret for 21 years. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ezra looked down. "It was tucked inside my guitar, hidden beneath the lining of the neck compartment. I never noticed it before, but after yesterday, after the song, I couldn't stop thinking. I took the whole guitar apart last night, and this was there." Naomi pressed the paper to her chest. "Do you know what this means?" Ezra exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I think it means everything I've ever known might be a lie." He sat down then, slowly, as if the weight of the discovery had finally caught up with him. Naomi joined him, laying the paper gently on the table between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Ezra said, "George always told me my mother died, that I was alone, that God placed me in his care." He shook his head. "But if this is real, if my name isn't Ezra, if I'm Micah, then who was she?" Naomi met his eyes, her voice trembling but steady. She was someone who never stopped waiting, never stopped believing, even when everyone else said it was over. He didn't cry then. He only looked at her, long and deep, as if something inside him was waking up. "I want to know everything," he whispered. "I want to know who I really am." Naomi reached for his hand and placed hers over it. "Then we'll find out, together." But even as she said it, she knew the answers they sought wouldn't come easy. There were still walls to break, lies to confront, a man to expose. The name on the paper was a beginning, but the truth still lived in shadows. Naomi didn't sleep the night Ezra showed her the folded paper bearing Micah's name and birth date. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, the letter laid flat before her like sacred scripture, the journal from Sister Clara propped open beside it, and every shred of documentation she had collected over the years spread across the surface like a map leading to a single man: George Barrett. The name no longer whispered guilt in the margins. Now it burned at the center of everything. As the early morning light crept through the blinds, Naomi picked up the phone and called Detective Miriam Owens, one of the only remaining officers who had worked on Micah's case during the first year of the investigation. Naomi hadn't spoken to her in nearly a decade, but when the line connected and no woman developed herself, Owens didn't hesitate. "Tell me what you found," she said, her voice instantly sober. Within 24 hours, Naomi and Owens met at the station, where Naomi laid out the evidence: Ezra's note, Lillian's journal, the tape recording, and the photograph of Micah with the unmistakable birthmark. Owens, who had grown disillusioned with the force's inaction over the years, felt her resolve rekindling as she scanned each page. She opened an internal case review and requested access to the original custody documentation filed by George Barrett in 2005. When the record finally surfaced, it was as Naomi had feared. George had submitted a handwritten affidavit claiming guardianship over a child named Ezra Wynn, citing the mother, Lillian Crow, as deceased. There was no accompanying birth certificate, no court validation, no legal stamp of approval. Just George's signature and a typed letter, clearly forged, using Lillian's name and a fabricated statement. "I, Lillian Crow, of sound mind, hereby relinquish all parental rights to my son Ezra Wynn and entrust his care to Reverend George Barrett, my spiritual advisor and the boy's rightful guardian." The file had slipped through due to a clerical loophole. Back then, the Shepherd's Fold was considered a religious commune with autonomy over internal guardianship, a policy that had since been amended after the commune's 2018 closure. But now, with this evidence in hand, Owens contacted the county attorney. Meanwhile, Naomi, driven by a need for closure and justice, reached out to a support group for parents of abducted children. She posted anonymously, detailing what she had uncovered and asking if anyone else had encountered George Barrett in the years following the Shepherd's Fold's operation. Within days, Naomi received a private message from a man named Reuben Field. Reuben claimed that in 2007, George had approached him through a small Christian parenting network, offering to place a baby with a loving family off the grid, no paperwork needed. At the time, Reuben and his wife had been desperate for a child, grieving from multiple miscarriages. But Reuben had grown uneasy when George insisted on cash donations to the ministry and refused to provide documentation. They declined the offer. A year later, Reuben heard rumors that George had placed a newborn with another couple in Tennessee. Again, no paperwork. Reuben had kept emails and a scanned copy of a handwritten letter George had sent him. Naomi forwarded everything to Owens, who now had enough to push for an arrest warrant. On a Sunday morning, as sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Bartholomew's and George Barrett stood at the pulpit preaching forgiveness to a room full of nodding heads, two unmarked cars pulled into the church parking lot. Naomi was not there, but she could imagine it, George's calm voice echoing across pews, his hands raised not in surrender, but in theatrical blessing. She pictured the moment the officers stepped inside, their badges raised, their words cold and unyielding. "Reverend George Barrett, you are under arrest for falsification of legal documents, obstruction of justice, and unlawful guardianship." They let him finish his sermon. He was escorted out mid-hymn. A murmur ran through the congregation like wind through tall grass. George didn't resist. His face remained unreadable, but his hand shook when they cuffed him. Naomi received the call from Owens later that afternoon. "He's in custody," the detective said. "And he's already started talking?" Naomi sat very still, her hand resting on the photograph of Micah, her thumb brushing against the printed birthmark. Like a benediction. "What did he say?" she asked. Owens hesitated. He says he thought he was saving the child, that he believed you were incapable of raising him, that Lillian was broken, that he was the only one who could give the boy a righteous life." Naomi laughed, bitter and hollow. "So he played God." Owens didn't answer that. Later that evening, Naomi stood in front of the church she had once walked into, holding Micah in her arms, her footsteps echoing down that same marble hallway where she had once fallen, her memories splintering. The building looked smaller now, the sanctuary faded. She wasn't there to confront ghosts, she was there to reclaim what was stolen. Ezra hadn't called her yet. She didn't know how much he had heard or whether he was ready for the truth in its full weight. But she would wait, just as she always had. Because George Barrett had told his final sermon, and for the first time in 21 years, Naomi no longer felt like a woman waiting in vain. The room where Naomi waited with Ezra at the community clinic was brightly lit but oppressively silent, the kind of silence that makes fluorescent lights hum louder and the sound of paper shifting feel like thunder. Ezra sat beside her, his knee bouncing, his fingers curled into the sleeves of his flannel shirt. Naomi had filled out the forms with careful precision, her handwriting small but unwavering. She hadn't asked him to do the test. She had only said, "If you want answers, real answers, this is how we find them." Ezra had nodded once, solemnly, then followed her here with no further discussion. Now they sat in the little side room, waiting for the technician to arrive with the swab kits. Naomi glanced at him. His face was pale but composed, though every so often his eyes flickered to the small photo she had tucked inside her wallet. The same photo he had seen before, the one of Micah at 7 months old, smiling beneath that unmistakable flame-shaped birthmark. The technician entered, soft-spoken and efficient, and within minutes the swabs were sealed, labeled, and sent out for processing. Estimated turnaround, 5 to 7 business days. It felt like an eternity. That night, Ezra followed Naomi home. He didn't ask if he could stay. She didn't ask if he wanted to. But when she pulled a spare set of sheets from the linen closet and handed them to him with a small, almost trembling smile, he nodded and said, "Thanks." She offered him the guest room, small, plain, but quiet. It had once been a study, then a storage space, then empty for years. Now it held a guitar propped against the closet, a notebook left open on the desk, and the beginnings of something else neither of them could name. In the days that followed, they fell into a rhythm that was cautious but curiously natural. Naomi brewed tea every morning, leaving the kettle warm in case he wanted some. Ezra wandered the shelves of the library during the afternoons, sometimes helping with reshelving or pretending to read while watching her from across the counter. In the evenings, he sat in the living room with his guitar, scribbling into his notebook between gentle chords, the beginnings of a new melody shaping itself line. He never played the lullaby again, not out loud, but Naomi could hear it in the way he ended each new song, those last few notes always bending into something soft and familiar, like a whisper in the dark. One evening, she brought out a box she hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside were Micah's baby socks, a lock of his hair from his first trim, and a birthday card she had written every year but never sent. Ezra sat beside her on the couch, silent as she showed him each item. He held the tiny socks in his hand, studying them like relics. "I don't remember," he said quietly, "but I feel like I miss this." Naomi didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached into the box and pulled out the old hospital bracelet. It read, "Mac handled it, mailed July 4th for..." She handed it to him, her hand trembling. "Her name," she said softly, "before it was changed." Ezra stared at the bracelet for a long time, then placed it carefully on the coffee table beside his lyric notebook. On the 4th night, the call came. Naomi answered on the first ring, her voice breathless. The lab technician confirmed her identity, then read the result aloud. "There's a 99.99% probability of biological maternity," he said, clinically precise. "The tested individual is confirmed to be Micah Landers." Naomi thanked him, though she couldn't hear her own word. Her throat tightened, her chest ached, and when she hung up the phone, she didn't move for several minutes. Ezra had been standing in the doorway, his arms crossed loosely, watching her with the anxious stillness of someone waiting to be told who they are. She looked at him then, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "It's you," she whispered. "You're Micah." Ezra didn't react right away. He blinked once, then again, as if trying to make the words settle into place. "I thought maybe," he said, "but hearing it? It feels like I lost something and found it, all at once." That night, Naomi sat on the edge of her bed with the hospital bracelet curled in her palm, tears sliding down her cheeks, not from pain, but from the strange and overwhelming relief of finally knowing, not hoping, not imagining, knowing. Her son was alive. Her son was home. In the next room, Ezra, Micah, sat by the window with his guitar in his lap, the moonlight tracing a silver outline around his silhouette. He plucked a few quiet notes, then set the guitar down and opened the notebook again. At the top of the page, in all capital letters, he wrote, "The sky waits for her." Underneath, he scribbled the first lyric, "I heard her voice before I knew her name." The melody would come later, shaped from the lullaby that lived in his marrow, the same one that had made him cry in a library back room without understanding why. Naomi listened from her doorway, her hand pressed against the wood, not daring to interrupt. She didn't want to break the moment. For now, this was enough, this quiet music, this presence that had once been a void, this boy who had disappeared into silence and returned through song. Micah hadn't called her mom yet, and she hadn't asked him to. The word didn't need to be spoken. It lived in the tea she brewed, in the socks she unfolded, in the way he looked at the photo of himself without knowing how to fit into it, in the way he stayed. The library's community room was small, nestled in the back corner past the children's section, but on that Thursday evening it pulsed with a quiet energy that made even the worn carpet and mismatched chairs feel sacred. Naomi had pulled a few strings to reserve the space for an intimate performance, and though she hadn't advertised it widely, word had spread in the way beautiful things tend to, organically, tenderly, as if the town itself had been waiting to hear this story, told not through headlines, but through melody. Ezra stood at the front, adjusting the strap on his guitar, the overhead lights catching in the waves of his dark hair. He didn't wear anything flashy, just a soft gray sweater and jeans, but there was something new in the way he carried himself, an ease, a steadiness, as though the fractured pieces of his life had finally begun to align. Naomi sat in the second row, her hands folded gently in her lap, next to Detective Owens, who had become something of a quiet fixture in their lives since the arrest. On Naomi's other side sat a small boy from the neighborhood who had taken to Ezra's music like breath, his eyes wide with anticipation. Ezra glanced toward Naomi briefly before he began, offering her a smile that wasn't shy or forced, but rooted, like a tree realizing it no longer needs to bend against the wind. Then he strummed the first chords of a song no one else in the room had ever heard before. He called it Weighted Sky. The opening melody was simple, almost skeletal, but it carried the same ghostly thread of that old lullaby Naomi once sang, now reborn with strength and shape. The verses painted a picture of a boy drifting through towns and names, of half-memories and voices that echoed through walls he didn't know he had built. The chorus swelled, not with grandeur, but with ache. She was a whisper I know no need had built. Naomi's eyes brimmed but did not spill. She had cried enough. The tears that sat in her lashes now were not of sorrow, but of release. When Ezra reached the final verse, the room held its breath. Though 21 years pulled us apart, he sang softly. You never stopped standing beneath that sky, waiting for me. The last note lingered like a held promise, then faded into silence. The audience didn't clap right away. They simply sat, held by something greater than sound. When the applause finally came, it was slow, reverent, and full of something deeper than appreciation, recognition. Naomi stood only when Ezra stepped down, his guitar slung loosely over his back, his eyes a little wet now too. They didn't hug dramatically or fall into one another. She simply touched his shoulder as he passed, and he nodded, the connection between them more profound than any display could express. Later that week, the state issued an official document recognizing the identity correction. Ezra Wynn was now legally Micah Ezra Landers. The process had involved paperwork, sworn affidavits, and a long conversation with a court representative who had known Naomi's name since the early 2000s. "I always hoped this case would find an ending," the woman said, sliding the certificate across the desk. Naomi took it in both hands, her fingers trembling not with fear, but with reverence. The name Micah, written in ink, no longer belonged to a ghost. It belonged to a man she had found again, not through vengeance or violence, but through a voice that refused to be silenced. At home, the rhythm between them settled into something soft and sustainable. Micah, as he now allowed himself to be called, stayed in the guest room, though some evenings he fell asleep on the couch, guitar still in hand, the notebook of lyrics now full with crossed-out lines and revisions. Naomi didn't ask questions. She didn't need answers to. They moved gently around each other, learning each other's rhythms, not as mother and son trying to reclaim lost time, but as two people choosing to make new memories. They didn't force labels. Naomi never pushed him to call her Mom. She knew titles didn't matter as much as moments, shared glances over breakfast, the silence of two people reading side by side, the unspoken agreement that neither of them would ever leave again. But every morning, like clockwork, Micah would enter the kitchen, rub the sleep from his eyes, and greet her with a quiet, stubborn, unwavering, "Ma." And that was enough. Sometimes, in the evenings, Naomi would sit on the porch with a blanket draped over her knees, watching the sky change colors while Micah played a quiet tune inside. The music floated out through the windows, curling around her like memory. She didn't need the whole song to feel it, just the first 3 notes. They were the same ones she had once hummed while holding a baby against her chest, and now he had. So had she. In the silence between those notes, there was no grief left, only presence, only light, only the endless open sky, finally waiting for no one. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next mystery we unravel. I'm curious, what part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it the song, the journal, or the final reveal? And by the way, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know.